Hi, this is Don Farber with VineyardSoft Corporation, and I'd like to welcome you to this training session on the KnowledgeSync solution. The topic for this training session will be Aggregate Query Design in KnowledgeSync. Now, aggregate queries are somewhat different from both record-level queries and value change queries in that aggregate queries get triggered by a group of records collectively meeting certain criteria. For example, you could use an aggregate query to total up all of the overdue invoices per vendor and then see if that total for any vendor exceeds a certain threshold. Or an aggregate query could be used to count up the number of open high-priority support calls and see if that number of calls exceeds a certain limit. Now, aggregate queries are designed somewhat similarly to record-level queries, and as such, we recommend that before going through this training session that you have listened to the 6 Query Design Basics training sessions. Now in KnowledgeSync there are 5 aggregate functions that you can choose from. The first is the summarize or sum function that lets you total the value of a numeric field, such as totaling up all of the invoices per product line, region, customer, etc. over a particular time frame. There is also the count function that lets you count the number of records that meet certain criteria, such as counting the number of open support tickets or counting the number of late deliveries. The average aggregate function allows you to derive the numeric average. And finally, there are the minimum and maximum functions, such as identifying the most recently completed step for a project or identifying the least profitable sale placed last week. Now, aggregate queries are going to be addressed in 2 training sessions. This training session is going to walk you through the creation of an aggregate query that uses the summarize function. The following training session will walk you through the creation of an aggregate query using the count function. So, without further ado, let's create our new aggregate query. And we're going to look at vendor information. We're going to look at their overdue invoices to see if their total of overdue invoices exceeds a certain amount. So, having put in the description for this query, let's start designing it. Now, we begin, like any other query, by choosing the tables that we want this query to retrieve data from. I happen to know that my AP invoices are stored in a table called Open Invoice, and the details of my vendors are stored in a table called Vendor Master. So I'll choose those 2 tables and proceed with the next step, which is to link those tables together. Starting off with the primary table, which is the Open Invoice table, linked to my Vendor Master and linked using the vendor number. We are now ready to proceed with the Columns tab, and here's where an aggregate query changes in terms of its definition versus a record-level query. When designing an aggregate query, the first thing that you need to do when you reach the Columns tab is to identify the field that you wish to perform the aggregate function on. In this particular case, we wish to total or summarize the balance of overdue invoices. So we need to locate the field that contains an invoices balance. So I'm going to move down to my invoice field, scroll up a little bit, and locate invoice balance. Now, unlike a record level or value change query where the column type is always left as normal, it is in an aggregate query where you choose one of the 5 following aggregate functions. And in this particular case, since we want to total the value of invoices, we're going to choose the sum or summarize function. And because we are now going to be retrieving the total balance for all invoices, not just a single invoice, we're going to make our customized name read balance underscore total. Now, interestingly enough, if I clicked on my preview tab right now to test the results of this query, what I would get is a single field that totals up the value of all invoices in my accounting system, some $421,000 worth of invoices. But that's not really what I want. Although this could be helpful at some point, for right now, what I actually want is the total per vendor. So I'm going to go back to my Columns tab, and here is where the fun really begins with an aggregate query, because once you choose the field that you're performing the aggregate function on, I am totaling the balance of my invoices, whatever columns you choose next automatically become group by fields. I want to group or break that balance by vendor. So I'm going to go to my vendor table, and I'm going to look for the field that stores my vendor's name. So I believe that's down towards the lower part of this list. I'm going to choose vendor name, and now let's take a look once again at preview. Now here what we're looking at is a bit more helpful. I can now see the total balance per vendor. Excellent. Now in thinking about this query, we might want to use it in an event that actually notifies the vendor themselves to get them to pay up. In that case, I will also need to retrieve the vendor's email address. So I'm going to go back to my columns tab one more time and scroll up my list of vendor fields until I find the vendor's email address, add that as a column to this query, once again hit preview, and now I really like the results. Obviously, I need to put in some email addresses for others of my vendors, but so far, so good. Now, the next step I need to take is to apply some filters to these invoices, because the way this query is designed right now is KnowledgeSync is totaling up all of the invoices for any given vendor, and in truth, I only want to total up those invoices that are overdue. So I'm going to go to my Filters tab, and I'm going to scroll down until I get to my invoice table, and I'm going to look for an invoice's due date. And here we have it. I'm going to select it, and I only want to total up those invoices where their due date is prior to the current date. That means that they're overdue. So I'm going to change my operator to less than, and I'm going to go to my compare value field and click on my list button that appears there and use one of my handy date substitution variables. Now I want to use the current date variable, but I happen to know that in this particular accounting system, dates are stored in the format YYYY-MM-DD. So I'm going to be careful to choose that particular date variable and say OK. And now my list is going to show me the total of invoices per vendor for only those invoices that are overdue for payment. Almost there. I just need to take one last step, because once again, if we take a look at the description of this query, we not only want to total all of the overdue invoices per vendor, but we only want to know about those vendors where the total is greater than a certain amount. That's the total greater than X. Now, with an aggregate query, what we're really doing here is we're wanting to perform a test or a filter on the aggregate result itself. And that, in KnowledgeSync, is referred to as a subfilter. And in fact, subfilters are used only with aggregate queries. You'll notice that I've got some fields to choose from here, only one that interests me, the sum of those overdue invoices. So I'm going to create a filter on that aggregate value and say that I only want to retrieve those vendors where their total of overdue balances is greater than, let's say $1,000. And now let's see our matching results. Much shorter list, and if I take a look at the balance total, I'll notice that they are all indeed over $1,000. The lowest one looks like it starts at $1,100. Now, just like a normal filter, if I wanted to, I could come to my sub-filter and make this compare value parameter driven. I could put a question mark in here and put an optional prompt that says the overdue balance is greater than a certain amount. And let's test this query one more time. Let's look now for over $5,000 in the total overdue invoices, and now our list is even shorter. We've lost our vendor there whose balance was merely $1,100. So at this point, we are done creating this aggregate query. So I'm going to click on Save and Close and come back to the main Event Manager window. Now that wraps up this training session, but as I said, the training sessions on aggregate query design have been divided into two parts, this part and a subsequent training session that walks you through a similar series of steps for creating an aggregate query that uses the count function. So Thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to speaking with you in a future KnowledgeSync training session. Thank you very much.